At the top of the world, where compasses spin wildly and the sun vanishes for months at a time, a new kind of war is being written into the map. Not with tanks crossing open plains, but with submarines gliding beneath pack ice, icebreakers carving fresh trade lanes, and fighter jets scrambling from runways built where no runway should exist. This is the Arctic, and for the first time in human history, it is no longer empty. For most of the 20th century, the Arctic Ocean was frozen solid, sealed off from the ambitions of great powers by a wall of ice thicker than most buildings are tall. It was a natural buffer zone, too remote, too hostile, too unpredictable for anyone to fight over. That wall is disappearing. Rising temperatures in the polar region are outpacing the rest of the planet, and each summer the ice retreats further than the last. Where explorers once needed months and nuclear-powered icebreakers to survive a single crossing, cargo ships are now completing commercial voyages along routes that were pure fantasy a generation ago. The northern sea route, hugging Russia's Arctic coastline, has gone from a handful of experimental transits to dozens of commercial voyages a year. A journey that once took roughly 40 days through the Suez Canal can now be cut down to about 20, avoiding choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandab altogether. And it isn't just about shipping time. Geological surveys have long suggested the Arctic could hold a substantial share of the world's undiscovered oil and natural gas, along with rare earth minerals critical to modern defense and technology industries. As the ice retreats, resources once locked beneath permanent pack ice start to look reachable. For decades, the 8 Arctic nations managed this region through a fragile system of cooperation, most visibly through the Arctic Council. But that cooperation cracked the moment Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine. Western Arctic states suspended joint work with Moscow, and the region that had prided itself on being the last corner of the planet immune to great power rivalry was suddenly exposed to it. What's left behind is a vacuum. And into that vacuum, 3 very different powers are now moving, each with a very different goal. Russia, defending what it calls its northern flank. NATO, watching its longest and coldest border grow more exposed by the year. And China, a country with no Arctic coastline at all, determined not to be left out of whatever comes next. Nowhere is this competition more visible than along Russia's own Arctic frontier, where Moscow has spent the better part of 2 decades quietly building what can only be described as a fortress. At the center of it sits the Northern Fleet, headquartered at Severomorsk on the Kola Peninsula. This is not a coastal patrol force. Its order of battle includes dozens of surface warships and a submarine fleet numbering in the 30s, several of them nuclear-powered, and carrying the weapons that make up the backbone of Russia's strategic deterrent. The Kola Peninsula isn't just a naval base. It's the storage vault for a large share of Russia's second strike nuclear capability. Spread across the islands of the Russian Arctic, Alexandra Land, Novaya Zemlya, Wrangel Island, Kotelny, is a chain of reactivated and modernized Soviet-era airfields. At Nagorskoye on Alexandra Land, Russia has been extending the runway to handle heavy bombers, transport aircraft, and interceptor jets, backed by radar networks and long-range air defense systems. Officially, Moscow describes these as search and rescue outposts, built to support increased shipping traffic. In practice, they double as forward operating bases, capable of projecting military power across the top of the world. Then there's the ice itself. Russia operates the largest fleet of icebreakers on the planet,
several dozen strong, including a number of nuclear-powered heavy icebreakers that never need to return to port for fuel. Some of the newer vessels in this fleet are armed with cruise missiles, blurring the line between an economic tool and a weapon of war. Beneath the surface lies a quieter, more unsettling piece of this puzzle. An organization known by the acronym GUGI. Officially, it's described as a deep-sea research directorate. Western defense analysts believe it actually operates specialized submarines capable of diving to extreme depths, vessels built not for combat in the traditional sense, but for locating, mapping, and potentially tampering with the undersea cables and pipelines the modern world depends on for its internet traffic and its energy. Russian officials have not been shy about what all of this is for. Russia's own foreign minister has told reporters that Moscow is, in his words, fully ready for a conflict with NATO in the Arctic, a blunt admission that the buildup along Russia's northern edge is no longer simply about economic development. It is about preparing for the possibility of a fight in a theater most of the world still imagines as empty.
Russia's northern buildup did not happen in a vacuum, and NATO's response reshaped the map of the Arctic almost overnight. For decades, the alliance's presence in the high north rested on a handful of members, Norway, Denmark, Canada, and the United States among them, facing a long stretch of Russian coastline. That changed when Finland and then Sweden abandoned decades of military non-alignment and joined NATO, a direct response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Finland alone added over 1,000 kilometers of new NATO-Russia border, much of it Arctic terrain Moscow had never had to defend before. The strategic consequences were immediate. Russian naval installations that once sat safely in Russia's own backyard, submarine bases like GUGI, home to some of the Northern Fleet's most sensitive assets, now sit within a couple hundred kilometers of NATO territory. Russian officials responded by announcing new troop formations in the northwest of the country, framing it as a necessary counter to what they called NATO expansion at Russia's expense. NATO, for its part, has been racing to build the tools it needs to actually operate in this environment, one where extreme cold, long stretches of darkness, and vast open water make traditional surveillance extraordinarily difficult. Multinational anti-submarine exercises now bring together warships and aircraft from across the alliance to track Russian submarine activity in the Norwegian Sea. New task forces have been stood up specifically to test uncrewed drones, underwater sensors, and shared data networks, an attempt to build a live picture of what's moving beneath Arctic waters before it becomes a crisis. None of this guarantees NATO parity with Russia's decades-long head start. Russia's icebreaker fleet alone dwarfs what the alliance can currently put on the ice, and permanent Western military infrastructure north of the Arctic Circle remains thin compared to what Moscow has built. But the strategic logic has shifted. What was once NATO's quietest flank is now one of its most closely watched. A frontier where a miscalculation between submarines, icebreakers, or fighter jets could escalate faster than almost anywhere else on the map.
Halfway around the world from the Arctic Circle, in Beijing, a country with no Arctic coastline of its own has spent nearly a decade working to secure a foothold in this region anyway. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, a description that raised eyebrows among the 8 nations that actually border the Arctic Ocean, given that China's closest coastline sits well over 1,000 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. Regardless, Beijing laid out its ambitions officially years ago, describing plans to help build what it calls the Polar Silk Road, an extension of its global Belt and Road strategy into the melting north. The path to that goal runs directly through Moscow. Because the northern sea route hugs Russia's coastline and falls under Russian regulatory control, China's Arctic ambitions depend on Russian cooperation. Icebreaker escorts, transit permissions, port access. That partnership deepened sharply after Western sanctions pushed Russia to lean further east, with the two countries signing successive agreements on Coast Guard cooperation and joint development of the Arctic Passage. The payoff is already visible on the water. Chinese shipping lines have begun running scheduled container routes from Chinese ports to European destinations, cutting a roughly 40-day Suez Canal voyage down to about 20 days by sailing north of Russia instead. For a country whose economy depends on maritime trade routes that pass through narrow, easily blockaded choke points, the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, an Arctic alternative isn't just about faster shipping. It's about reducing a strategic vulnerability that becomes especially dangerous in the event of a wider regional conflict. Not everyone views this expansion as benign. Washington has pushed back hard, with American officials renewing long-standing interest in Greenland specifically to prevent what they describe as Chinese and Russian encroachment on the island's strategic position. Beijing, in turn, has accused Western media of exaggerating what it calls an Arctic China threat theory, insisting its Arctic activity is commercial and scientific, not military. Whichever framing is closer to the truth, the practical result is the same. A region once defined by isolation now has three major powers with competing visions for who controls its future, and a fourth, non-Arctic power, quietly building the infrastructure to make sure it has a say too. If this competition ever turns into confrontation, a handful of places stand out as the most likely trigger points. Greenland sits near the top of that list. The island hosts Pituffik Space Base, a critical piece of America's early warning system against ballistic missile launches from Russia's Kola Peninsula, and a key node in what the United States calls its Golden Dome missile defense architecture. Greenland's location along the shortest possible flight path between North America and both Russia and China gives it an outsized strategic value that has nothing to do with its small population, which is exactly why renewed American interest in acquiring the island has alarmed both Copenhagen and Beijing alike. Svalbard presents a quieter but equally sensitive flashpoint. Administered by Norway under a century-old international treaty that guarantees other signatory nations, including Russia, the right to economic activity there, the archipelago sits in a legal gray zone. Moscow has periodically challenged Norway's authority to apply NATO-related restrictions on the islands, a dispute that, on paper, is about mining rights and fishing quotas, but underneath is really about who gets to define demilitarized in a treaty written over a century ago. Then there's the seabed itself, the fiber optic cables and pipelines that carry everything from financial transactions to military communications between North America and Europe. Reports of unexplained damage to undersea infrastructure in northern European waters in recent years have repeatedly drawn suspicion toward Russian vessels, including ones linked to that same shadowy deep-sea directorate operating specialized submarines built for exactly this kind of seabed work. A single cut cable is treated as an accident. A pattern of them, in strategically useful locations, starts to look like a rehearsal. None of these flashpoints guarantee open conflict. The Arctic's brutal environment still imposes limits that no amount of military investment can fully erase. Extreme cold, months of darkness, and distances that make sustained combat operations logistically punishing for every power involved, including Russia. But the margin for error has narrowed. A region that used to enforce peace through sheer inaccessibility is now accessible enough to fight over, and inaccessible enough
that a crisis there could unfold for weeks before the rest of the world even noticed.
The Arctic was never truly empty. It was simply locked.
What's changing now isn't the ambition of the powers circling it. Russia, the United States, China, and the rest of NATO have all wanted influence over this region for generations. What's changing is the ice itself, opening doors that used to stay shut for 11 months of the year. Russia has spent 2 decades turning its Arctic coastline into the most heavily militarized stretch of polar territory on Earth. NATO has responded by absorbing 2 new members and scrambling to build the surveillance tools it never needed before. And China, thousands of kilometers from the nearest Arctic shoreline, has found a way to make itself a stakeholder anyway. One container ship, one joint agreement with Moscow at a time. None of these powers wants a shooting war at the top of the world. The costs of fighting in that environment are brutal, even for well-funded militaries. But history rarely waits for convenient timing, and the Arctic now holds nearly every ingredient that has started conflicts elsewhere. Contested resources, disputed shipping lanes, overlapping military claims, and 3 great powers each convinced the others are moving first. The ice that once made this region unreachable was also what kept it peaceful. As that ice disappears, so does the buffer that kept the world's most powerful militaries at arm's length from each other. What replaces it, cooperation or confrontation, may be one of the defining strategic questions of the coming decade. Where every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind.